we just need to stop thinking about housing as something you almost compete for. It's like something you win. It needs to be something that all people have entitlement to, just because it's a human right.
House prices are too high and rents are shooting up.
Sydney is in the grip of a rental crisis.
The cost of living is rising and families are paying the price. Young families with full-time incomes left with no other option but to live in tents.
Developers are declaring bankruptcy before finishing construction, leaving new owners stranded.
The high-profile company has gone bust and work has ceased immediately on 1,500 homes in Victoria and another 200 in Queensland.
And then there's the lack of security and availability for renters and social housing tenants.
Rent got 10 years and I just packed up and left.
As you search for answers to the housing crisis, it's easy to get lost in all the noise. We're here to help you see the big picture. In this season of Homes Not Houses, we're unpacking the different components of the housing system, what the key issues are, who wins and loses from the current system, and try to answer just how housing has become such an enormous problem many decades in the making.
The housing boom is about to end, and for many Australians, it's going to end in tears.
Families are living in tents, and the local council is pleading with both sides of politics to make housing a major priority.
How did we get to the point where so many young Australians have lost hope in the Australian dream?
With help from a range of housing experts, join us as we break down what led to this policy failure and what we can do to ensure that in the future we can all live in affordable and high-quality homes. My name is Matt Lloyd-Cape, and I'm the director of the Centre for Equitable Housing, an initiative of Per Capita. Our team has been researching the impact of poor housing for the past 15 years. And over that time, we've seen the Australian housing system come under increasing pressure, uncovered some damning trends, and heard the heartbreaking stories of those affected, as well as talking to housing academics, researchers, and organisations who are seeking to find lasting solutions to our housing issues. This is Homes Not Houses, an investigative podcast recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, which puts the housing system under the microscope and examines the factors which exacerbate inequality across the nation. Join us for the 6-part series where we unpack the current housing crisis, how we got here, who wins and loses from the current system, what sort of better housing system could we have, and how we can get there.
It's called a home.
Part 1. The mess we're in.
The great Aussie dream. Whether it's the posh palace by the water or dependable fibro, Aussies will do anything for their own piece of real estate.
A home of one's own. It's the Australian dream, one baked deep into the national psyche. We Aussies are known worldwide for our love of real estate. From workers' cottages and farmsteads to the stilted Queenslanders, Victorian inner-city townhouses and modern high-rise apartments, there's a place for everyone to call home. And for much of our history, the principle was that just about anyone, no matter where they came from or their socio-economic background, could look forward to a future in which they owned their own home. In fact, in 1971, around 2/3 of 30 to 34-year-olds did just that, compared to roughly half today. But somewhere along the way, the Australian dream became a nightmare. We're currently living through an era of skyrocketing housing prices, scant rental and social housing supply, crushing mortgage debt, and no light at the end of the tunnel. One in which younger Australians are locked out of home ownership and an increasing number of older Australians are on the precipice of homelessness. How did housing shift from being a point of national pride to one of dismay and despair?
So now I actually see it fundamentally as a financial problem, a way of the housing property has kind of been repurposed. We've reframed housing from home to asset.
That's Hugh Belfrage, Director of V&F Housing Enterprise Foundation, a philanthropic foundation that supports research and policy development such as ours and helps us look for different ways to imagine how housing could be.
I bought a house in '94 in Northcote for $150,000. At that stage, what we now know is this kind of rapid and extended rise in the market had started, and so the houses had gone up 5% a year or so, and so we came back after Christmas and everything was 10 grand more. So we were relieved getting the market and excited then, because we're now owners, to see the market keep rising. But then I suppose over the next, that's nearly 30 years ago. Over the next decade, I think I started to wonder what's going on and then start to become uncomfortable.
Between 1980 and the mid-90s, house prices and wages grew at roughly the same rate. But in the late 1990s, house prices exploded and have since grown at twice the rate of wages. Our homes are now collectively worth more than $10 trillion. That's 4.5 times our entire annual economic output of the country. While prices have gone up, our wages haven't, particularly for young people. And stagnant wages aside, we've entered an era where jobs are less secure. The gig economy takes up a far greater share of our workforce now, which makes it harder for people to find stable work and save.
Being able to build up the kind of wealth that often is built up through home ownership. I've been lucky enough to be able to I've had steady employment and be able to buy a home, and also I was able to buy a home in the early 90s when it was something like, I suppose, 3 or 4 times our household income, not 8 or 9 times our household income, and the deposit you needed wasn't so high and all the rest of it.
That is Peter Mayers.
So my name's Peter Mayers. I'm an independent writer and researcher on public policy issues, particularly housing. I'm the author of a book called No Place Like Home, Repairing Australia's Housing Crisis, and I write regularly about housing for Inside Story magazine.
Both Hugh and Peter share examples of just how much the market has changed in 20 years. As of recording, the median house price is $740,600, which is up to 9 times the median household income. After a decade of stagnant wages, the global disruption of COVID, and the following period of inflation, it just keeps getting harder. And if you are unfortunate enough to lose your job, the low levels of social safety nets like unemployment benefits and Commonwealth rent assistance are simply insufficient to pay for rent, leading to just under half of low-income renters being in housing stress. By some measures, Australia's unemployment benefits are the lowest in the OECD, even lower than in the USA.
Nowadays, nationally, it's closer to 10 years to save for a 20% deposit. And that's assuming a 15% savings rate of median household incomes each year.
That's Eliza Owen. She's head of research at CoreLogic Australia.
Realistically, savings rates also fluctuate. They were very high during the pandemic period when people weren't really going anywhere and we had unprecedented peacetime fiscal stimulus. Fast forward to 2023, and those savings rates have dropped to about 3% nationally, given that people are having to expend more on housing costs, but also a higher cost of living in the inflationary environment.
That's Eliza Owen, head of research at CoreLogic, a housing data company.
House prices are nearly back to new record highs. We've just been through the largest rate hiking cycle on record, 425 basis points, possibly more to go, depending on the data flow with inflation, and still a relatively high deposit hurdle, which is nearly back at 10 years to save for a 20% deposit. So I think in some respects, housing affordability is the worst it's ever been. It really just depends on your access to wealth, a windfall of savings, and even your tenure while you're saving.
Australians with a mortgage copped another crippling cost of living hit last Tuesday, the 13th interest rate rise in 18 months.
So whether it's new homeowners struggling to pay off their mortgage or potential buyers unable to build or buy a new home, home ownership is increasingly difficult for many, particularly for young and low-income families. So buying a house is out of the question, but what about renting?
I feel like I'm part of a generation, a late baby boomer, part of a generation who have accumulated wealth by doing nothing except being lucky. Whereas Carolyn, who is still a very close friend of mine, has worked hard all her life and is still at the whim of landlords.
Caroline's story is one that has become too commonplace in Australian society. You've probably heard it in the news or from friends and family. Perhaps you're even experiencing it yourself right now. Australian renters are doing it tough, in particular those in the lower income bracket. Almost a third of Australian households now rent, with many staying in the rental market for much longer periods of time, often into periods of their lives when starting a family and seeking security is on the top of many people's minds. Increasingly, the spotlight has been thrown on poor conditions in the rental market and the distinct power imbalance between landlords and renters. In fact, Australian renters have some of the weakest rights of any developed country.
She has, for example, in her current flat, she's had to move her bed into the lounge room. It's only a 2-room flat, so there's a lounge room, kitchen and a bedroom, and she's had to move her bed into the lounge room because the bedroom is so mouldy because the shower is not properly sealed and is leaking through the wall and created mould. So, this is just a typical renter's story. But Carolyn's in her early 60s and when no one should have to live in those sorts of conditions.
It's certainly another piece, isn't it, that because we all expected to own a home, the rental was a step in that direction, so we didn't really pay much attention to it. And it's not a well-developed market, is it? It's not well regulated. It's not. There's no security, there's no stability, and there's no standards and enforcement. I mean, it's not true to say there are no standards. There are weak standards and enforcement, and all the onus, most of the onus is on tenants, to approach landlords, and of course, in a context of weak rights, you have no leverage. So a lot of people, we all know the stories of the mouldy walls and leaking and no heating and stuff, and that's not okay. That's heading towards, taking us towards two classes of Australians.
An absence of appropriate and enforceable quality standards, in particular the prevalence of dangerous black mould, is one thing. But given the ongoing threat of climate change, there's so much the building industry and governments need to address in future-proofing homes.
And we've seen it not just with COVID, but with the increase in extreme weather events as a result of climate change, and we're going to see even more of it, floods and bushfires and droughts and all the rest of it. When those things happen, people expect governments to step in and look after their health and protect their houses, their homes, and secure their jobs and so on.
There's a lot of anger and a lot of frustration. We're doing everything we can, set up 17 evacuation centres. We're going to be working day and night for weeks and months and years ahead. This is the most devastating scenes right across the Northern Rivers. You would never see anything like it.
In 2022, almost 5,000 homes were rendered uninhabitable after record floods in Queensland and New South Wales. Flooding continues to be a burden, with further floods on the East Coast in the summer of 2023 and 2024. On the other side of that coin, we're experiencing more instances of increasingly catastrophic bushfires across the nation. In 2020, over 24 million hectares were burnt across the country, and 3,000 homes were lost in some of the most destructive bushfires in living memory.
My property burnt, and I didn't want to go back to the property.
The fires it was an event, but it's an ongoing thing.
The cost of clean-up, repairs, relocating people and building new homes and infrastructure after these disasters skyrocketed into the billions. We need to make homes more durable, not only to protect them from the increasingly violent environment, but safer for people to live in, with proper irrigation, insulation and light so as to prevent mould and rot. And it goes to show it's not simply the type of house, but where we build. What makes things worse is the lack of rental laws that would prevent unreasonably short tenures and sudden, unpredictable spikes in rental prices. Renters lack protection from sudden changes in the market. Outside of Canberra, there were no rent stabilisation policies in place. And most tenants have very few guarantees that they can stay in their home for more than 1 year at a time. Given the current tight rental market, many renters have no choice but to put up with dilapidated and overpriced houses, while the government gives billions to landlords through tax breaks.
If you have a guest house where your mother-in-law stays, you have an Airbnb.
Added to these out-of-date rights and standards, the rise of new challenges such as short-stay rentals like Airbnb are just adding pressure to the availability of rental properties. When Airbnb first launched, enabling people to rent out their spare rooms, this ensured good use of available housing. But as the income from rental properties on short stays like Airbnb became more lucrative than renting it out for the long term, more and more landlords opted for the short stay option. In some areas, a landlord can make the same money from a short-term rental in a month that they would from renting the same property to a long-term tenant for a year. And then, of course, there's social housing. If someone can't buy a home or rent a home, surely they can access safe housing from the government, right? This was the case for much of the post-war period. In fact, in 1991, around 42% of renters in Darwin and Adelaide lived in public housing. Around the nation, around 25% of renters lived in public housing at that time. Flash forward to today, and this number is more like 1 in 10, with social housing stocks being in decline for some time. This is not due to a decline in demand, far from it. Waiting periods for social housing in some areas is now up to 10 years. Like with the private rental market, there are too many houses in a state of disrepair thanks to a lack of political commitment to house those in most need of support. A lack of affordable properties is pushing too many Australians into housing stress, and if they can't access social housing, they're at risk of homelessness.
Homelessness in Australia is increasing, and one of the biggest issues in homelessness is pretty simple, really. It's people not being able to get housing that they can afford, and there not just being enough low-cost rentals.
That's Kate Colvin.
So I'm Kate Colvin, the CEO of Homelessness Australia. So we've got a problem with the really low vacancy rates, which means that competition for rentals in the private market is really steep, and that means people just miss out. But also that the prices of those rentals are too high for people who are on quite low incomes. So those two issues combine together, and more than 50% of people who come to homeless services are there because of issues in the housing market or with financial stress. So those issues around affordability are really the biggest driver of homelessness. So, we've got growing homelessness, and at the moment, 123,000 people a night are experiencing homelessness. 6 or 7% of those are rough sleeping.
Initially I saw this as an issue. Everybody needs a home. It's a fundamental need. It's high in the hierarchy of needs for shelter and security.
That's Hugh again.
And then I think the way I think about it more now, Matt, is of course everyone still needs a home, but what's happening is that we are kind of gouging people, ordinary people, to get something that is a basic necessity for their life and a basic necessity for a thriving, productive society and economy. And it's that funneling of money out of households and out of families, and as a social worker, I think particularly about kids, in all those developmental years, those holidays, those clothes, those hobbies, that pocket money, the movies, there's much less of that going into their lives now for the lower socioeconomic half of society.
The social impacts of a tumultuous housing market cannot be understated. Poor housing can affect physical and mental health, social mobility, employment, and even our national economic productivity. And then there is also the way that the current housing system increases the class divide and gender inequality. While there's always been prejudice and stereotypes associated with different forms of housing arrangements, attitudes between renters, social housing tenants, landlords, and investors have sharpened into a more explicit culture of resentment and frustration. Less than 10% of total federal housing expenditure goes towards social housing and homelessness services, if you include tax breaks for property investors. With the cost of living skyrocketing, private rentals becoming more and more competitive, and a lack of funding going towards social housing, more and more Australians are facing the terrifying prospect of homelessness.
There's no help on the horizon for Sydney's housing crisis, with one of the federal government's main election commitments stuck in the Senate. The Greens say they won't support the multi-billion-dollar fund to build more affordable and social housing because it doesn't go far enough.
And it's not that we lack the resources to take on this issue. In 2023, the federal government spent $18 billion on tax relief for property investors, enough to build around 40,000 public housing units. But no government seems able to grasp the issues and offer a clear solution for those people worst affected by the current housing system. It's far from the idyllic Australian dream we once held as a point of national pride.
Part of the problem is there is nobody seen to be responsible for this problem. Like, who do you pin it on? I remember Scott Morrison famously saying, there's nothing we can do about the cost of housing, conveniently ignoring the tax settings. Of course, nobody wants to own the problem, so people don't know who to pin it on, and also I don't think anybody really knows what to ask for, like what to do. It's one thing to say, let's have a rent freeze, but that's not it's not actually very doable.
So that's where we are right now, in an absolute mess. But how exactly did we get here?
So as the rich get richer, any given level of income down at the bottom buys you less. So it's actually not just about the determinants of the wages of those at the bottom, but it's about the skyrocketing wealth of those at the top.
Join us next week as we take a closer look at how the housing market functions and dysfunctions, and just how policy and economic decisions led us into this crisis. I'm Matt Lloyd-Cape, and this has been Homes, Not Houses. This series is a production of Per Capita, an independent progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia. We work to build a new vision for Australia based on fairness, shared prosperity, community, and social justice, and we're committed to providing ad-free, editorially independent content. Homes Not Houses was produced on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present.